Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare with the last review that will tie into the 2017 game Prey. Threadbare reviews will continue after this, but the common theme that connects them will be different as I start playing a different game. But that's still in the future. For now, I'll be ending the review series with another personal pick, The High Crusade, a novel first published by Paul Anderson in 1960. About the author. Paul Anderson was born in 1926 in Pennsylvania to a Scandinavian family, although that family would move to Texas, Denmark, and then Minnesota before Anderson finished growing. Because of that, he went to the University of Minnesota to get his bachelor's degree in physics, and it was in his college years that Anderson started selling science fiction stories to John Campbell's Astounding Science Fiction. Paul Anderson never did enter a scientific field after graduating, and instead he started writing science fiction full-time after graduating in 1948. He then married 5 years later and moved to a small town near Berkeley, California, where he would spend the rest of his life. Anderson's political views were fairly standard for a Golden Age science fiction author, by which I mean that he was a right-wing libertarian who believed that a large government is harmful regardless of how free and fair its elections are. In fact, he seems to have preferred the idea of a feudal government, since there's a lot of independence between the layers of feudal contracts, and you always meet your feudal lord face to face. And never mind about how such governments frequently erupt into civil war because force is decentralized, and because relationships are personal rather than national. Anderson has also implied that hereditary titles are better because they involve some amount of eugenics, but then all of his protagonists prove the lie of that by accomplishing things well beyond what their ancestry would have you expect. Still, this focus on individuals and personalities also comes out in his writing style, which features a lot more descriptions and characterizations than what you would normally find in Golden Age sci-fi. He's also very imaginative when it comes to different planet types and the sapient aliens who evolve on them. And for the most part, these aliens are equal to humans in terms of intelligence and ability. And if the human protagonists end up exploiting something about the aliens to win the day, that something usually has to do with the aliens' culture or society. Something that can change in the future, rather than something that makes the aliens innately inferior. Along those lines, Anderson also invented the word sophont, which refers to any sort of being that is at least as intelligent as a human. The High Crusade came out relatively early in Anderson's career, but as you'll soon see, he definitely wrote it after he had soured on the idea of a one-world government. But there's no point in talking any further about the book in the authors section, so let's move on. The review. In the year of grace, 1345, not yet a decade into the 100 Years' War, Baron Roger de Tourneville calls his levy to the town of Ansby in Lincolnshire, England, in preparation for a campaign in France. However, just before they leave, a spaceship belonging to the Wurscore Empire lands just outside of town, and the occupants start shooting at the locals in a show of force. However, this angers the gathered troops instead of scaring them, and they end up rushing the ship and killing all but one of the Wurscorics in close combat, a type of combat the aliens have apparently forgotten how to defend against. They hold the survivor for several weeks, long enough to teach him Latin and figure out how to use the ship. And at that point, Sir Roger decides to bring the ship to France for the war, and then go liberate the Holy Land for good measure. However, the Wurscore captive named Branithar tricks Sir Roger by activating the emergency autopilot of the ship and sending it to one of the Wurscore Empire's planets. Roger responds by ramming the ship into the fortress Branithar had hoped would shoot the ship down, and then, by using a lot of bluffing and non-traditional tactics, Roger eventually conquers the other two forts on the planet and claims it for England. He then contacts the Empire's subject nations and convinces them to join him in a revolt, partly for the glory, and partly because the Empire would otherwise crush both him and his people for what they've done. Unfortunately, Roger's wife Catherine and Sir Owain Montbel would rather go back to Earth and forget the whole thing, and while Catherine eventually has a change of heart, she has to destroy their last chance of finding Earth again in the process. Like I said in the authors section, Paul Anderson is notable as a Golden Age author for creating characters with actual depth and character arcs, and that's definitely on display in The High Crusade. Sir Roger de Tourneville is intelligent, thinks quickly, and has an amazing poker face. but he also pushes himself too hard, is extremely anxious about a situation when he's in private, and frequently gets jealous of the way that Catherine and Sir Owain enjoy each other's company without him. The narrator of the story, Brother Parvis, thinks very little of himself, and so he minimizes the role he plays in events, despite being incredibly crucial to the whole thing, since he's the primary translator and Roger's only confidant. Something else the book demonstrates is how much the author clearly knows about England in the late medieval period. Longbow arrows are called cloth-yard arrows, the Norman nobles still prefer speaking French instead of English, and references to the Bible are both frequent and detailed. The book also goes out of its way to describe present-day and science fiction concepts in old-fashioned terms, since an English monk is the narrator. For instance, while force field uses old enough words to remain unchanged, the best way they can describe a laser gun is to call it a fire beam. Now, I am worried that it goes a bit overboard with the number of unexplained references, since I only understand them since I'm a big history buff, but I don't believe you have to have all of that English history as reference to understand the main plot points of the book. Now, a bigger issue I have with the book is that it stretches credulity in the way the Worskoriks are weak in just the right ways for the English to exploit. They aren't trained in close combat, they don't know how to respond to asymmetric warfare, and they're so centralized that as soon as the leadership crumbles, everyone else surrenders. But, with that being said, these situations have arisen in the past. The American army was clearly unprepared for the Viet Cong's traps and infiltration tactics during the Vietnam War, and Hernan Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire mostly by using the element of surprise, and convincing all the Aztec vassal nations to rise up at the same time. On top of that, the High Crusade somewhat makes up for the Worskor Empire's easy toppling by adding some intrigue within the English ranks. Owain and Catherine basically copy the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, and their betrayal of Roger helps to humanize it, and show that his success comes from luck and skill, and not because he's some Marty Stew who always gets what he wants because the author wants him to always win. The last thing I'll say about the High Crusade is that it's a pretty fast read, only about 197 pages long. As such, it's a good introduction to Paul Anderson's works, and for that reason, along with everything else I've mentioned, I strongly recommend it. The analysis. The main theme of the High Crusade is creative thinking is always more valuable than technology. The Worskor Empire has highly advanced technology, faster-than-light spaceships, laser guns, force fields, atomic bombs, fast-acting medical devices, and yet none of that helped them when Sir Roger rammed a ship into their fortress, pretended that his signet ring was a bomb, or flooded their main fortress with refugees so that they would run out of supplies and be forced to surrender. And because they couldn't guess what Sir Roger was going to do next, they lost. Another point the book makes is that medieval technology was not as primitive as post-medieval thinkers often believe. Plate mail could stop a bullet from a contemporary gun. Longbow arrows were so powerful that they could punch through plate armor and impale the person wearing it. Cannons were a common sight on battlefields, even at the start of the 100 Years' War, and trebuchets could toss projectiles that weighed 200 pounds or more. Medieval armies were also quite capable of digging and concealing large pits filled with spikes. Pits that maybe aren't as deadly to a tank as they are to a cavalry unit, but can still stop one from moving. Of course, the third theme of the book, albeit one that's less explored than the first two, is that feudalism is a better government system than a centralized bureaucracy. Now, I will admit that in the situation described by the book, which is that it can take days or even weeks for a message from a frontier planet to reach the homeworld, it does make sense for local governments to have more independence than what the Worskor Empire permits. However, the feudal system permitted so much independence that civil wars would break out basically every other generation. Serfdom was no picnic either, and the only reason serfdom ended in England is because the Black Death made labor more valuable, and the peasants were able to organize some revolts. In Eastern Europe, the peasants didn't get organized, and serfdom got worse. Now, the last theme I'd like to discuss is one that isn't quite as obvious as the first three, but does connect to the running theme of fear the unknown. In this case, the unknown is quite fearsome. The Worskoriks are monstrous yet intelligent, They know dark secrets that defy the teachings of the Holy Bible, and their goal is to strike fear in the hearts of humanity. But then humanity doesn't react with fear. They react with anger and fight the threat they face head-on. In the process, they discover that the dark arts are easier to understand than they thought, and the enemies they face are a lot more like humans than they first appeared. As a result, the unknown becomes known and the initial fear vanishes. And then as they continue to succeed, the worst Gorics begin to fear the unknown, that is humanity, and exploiting that fear becomes one of our greatest assets. So let's adapt the old sentence one last time. Do not fear the unknown, because that fear is more dangerous than the unknown itself. Instead, embrace the unknown. Learn all you can about it, because then you will erase your fear and gain the power of knowledge. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.